Hi, and welcome to the We've Got a Problem podcast, where each week we explore inspiring stories of struggle, success, and solutions to prevalent problems, and how our guests have turned a problem into an opportunity. This week, I'm joined by Marcus Schaller, entrepreneur, marketer, coach to other entrepreneurs and freelancers, and now a fellow podcaster helping people get unstuck and build the business they were born to create. Marcus, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm very, very excited to be here with you.
Yeah, so this is awesome. I every once in a while I get to talk to somebody else who has a podcast or is trying to do some of the same things, but in a different sphere than I am, and it's always great to get a chance to talk. Give us a little bit of your background. How did you get your start? What's your kind of story?
Got it. Well, my entrepreneurial adventure started back in the mid-90s. Around there, I was inspired initially by Richard Branson, like many people. Unfortunately, didn't realize how high that might be shooting, but it got me started. And
why not?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was somebody I could relate to in business, which was not typical for me at the time. I kind of came from a music kind of like, heavy metal drummer background kind of thing. So I wasn't really, thinking of the corporate route, but, he's just somebody who really interests me in his story and just the creativity of it. So my actual first business really was in personal fitness. I was a personal trainer. It got me interested in marketing more out of necessity than anything else. I had no real marketing background or sales background prior to that. And, when you need clients, you either figure out marketing and sales or you just do something else quickly. So I found out pretty quickly that I was actually more interested in marketing than I was in fitness. And so I did, one of many pivots in my career and started doing workshops in New York City, where I'm from originally, in that area. Wrote a book for McGraw, actually self-published it, and it got published by McGraw-Hill back in, I think, 2006. So, just kind of this adventure starting with, helping other, at that point, very small business owners and solopreneurs, even prior to that word existing, with essentially their branding and their marketing and how do they attract clients, all that. And that evolved into more recently doing copywriting work and messaging strategy for larger companies. So a lot of B2B SaaS technology, some agency work, things like that. So now, kind of bringing us to, post-pandemic, beginning of 2023, really, my career is a mix of both, right? So I do freelancing, the marketing, messaging, consulting, strategy, and copywriting stuff that I do for companies and agencies. And then now just recently started this WorkSelfLife Podcast, which you just mentioned, and the coaching that goes with it, and kind of going back to my coaching roots. So that's where I'm at now.
Got it. So, I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about your podcast, and actually about just the coaching idea in general, is how to get people unstuck. And that, I think, is a perennial theme in all of this. I'm certainly trying to solve it on mine. Haven't gotten there yet, dear listener. But you've just completed a 4-part series. I don't know if you've actually completed it. You've just posted 4 parts of a series on fear of rejection. And one of those things was overcoming limiting beliefs, which I think is a much broader theme than in just fear of rejection, because there are a lot of things that hold us back. What would you say are the big hurdles holding people back? I mean, what else is keeping people from thriving with your clients and the people that you've seen?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll start with my own personal perspective. I can't speak for, everybody else, of course, but I can tell you from my own experience, the thing that held me back the most in my life, in my career, that kept me stuck was fear of rejection, was limiting beliefs. And back around 2015, there was a personal kind of family issue that kind of like just shook my whole world, right? So up until then, I had been able to kind of get by the way I had been and avoid a lot of the real scary stuff, let's put it that way. And then this event in 2015 just took that off the table. So I had to grow up real fast. And this was in my 40s at this point. So there was some arrested development there when it comes to dealing with uncomfortable feelings and fear and all that. So I speak from personal experience. Everything that I talk about on the podcast and write about And this is all from my own having lived it, right? This is not theoretical in the sense of just pulling it from some books. And so what kept me stuck was, you mentioned the limiting beliefs, but kind of the accompanying, in yoga, they call them samskaras. So, one of the things I started learning back at that time was meditation and learning about yoga and mindfulness. And what I learned was a lot of the things that were holding me back were just these conditioned, whether you want to call them beliefs in a kind of cerebral sense or even just in our body, right? Mm-hmm. So we experience, there's a trigger, something in our life that we're facing, it's a obstacle, whatever it is, and it triggers us and we feel what we feel. Like for me, it's right in my chest, right? It's just like this dread, right? And so there's that and the accompanying beliefs, which are these stories, right? That we just have told ourselves for so long that we don't even recognize them as being stories anymore. They're just truth, right? So mine in particular, and I've written and, talked about this on the podcast, but mine in particular was very simple. It was, quote, "This won't work." Mm-hmm. That was my story, which you can imagine how frustrating that is to have when you have on one hand Richard Branson as your patron saint, and then on the other hand you have this running dialogue and of "this won't work." So it took me a few years to really get a handle on that. And that's actually why I waited till most recently to even start doing this podcast and the coaching, because I wanted to make sure, I wasn't just jumping off with what I thought was the fix. I want to make sure I had some miles under my belt. Yeah. But basically, just to round back to your question, what kept me stuck, and I think keeps a lot of people stuck, is the unwillingness and inability to deal with that discomfort, right? Yeah. We avoid it. We try to use positive thinking or try to tell ourselves a nicer story or tell ourselves that we're awesome and we got this. And yet that pain is still there. And for me, until I was actually willing and able to lean into that experience and into that pain and, all those things, I just kept going in circles because I just do something and then quit and do something and quit and on and on and on.
Well, that actually seems, again, like something that applies even more broadly than just entrepreneurs and people trying to have a business to life. So much of life is trying to avoid discomfort. And that's how so many of us at least spend a large portion of our lives is just trying to avoid discomfort. And I've talked about it on the episode I recorded yesterday. I've talked about it in far earlier episodes. One of my earliest guests, a guy named Kevin Palmieri, who actually also acts as kind of a podcast coach. He's kind of a cool guy. But he has a great way of putting it when he talks about the different zones of comfort. So there's the comfort zone, say, level 1 to 3 or 4. And then you've got your learning zone that's just above that. And then above that in the 8, 9, 10, you're into your anxiety zone. And you get into the anxiety zone and you're not, to talk about one of my other guests who talked about the reticular activating system and all the psychological stuff that goes on. You're when you're in the anxiety zone, you're certainly not in a frame of mind to take in, assimilate, and act on new information. So absolutely. But you also want to get out of that comfort zone because nothing is going to happen in that comfort zone. So we try to avoid discomfort. We just try and stay there. And there's just no progress that's going to happen. Of course, you're going to go in circles. Of course, you're going to be right there. But getting into that learning zone and, all right, I'm doing it. I'm okay. Everything's okay. And those zones move around because as you start to expose yourself to some of these things, and I'm not trying to continue to pitch my podcast to my existing listeners, but there's an episode with Scott Harris, who was a skydiving instructor. And he said, look, there's certain kinds of fear that are real. I mean, we're talking about there's rational fear and there's irrational fear. And the rational fear, like when you're about to jump out of an airplane as a skydiver, that is legitimate fear. That is a sign to pay attention to something. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about the stuff that's in your head that's holding you back from making a change. Those kind of irrational fears, that false evidence appearing real and all that kind of stuff, those stories that we've told ourselves, to circle back, Stories are powerful. Stories are what so much of our lives about, and we love a good story. We love to hear
especially our own,
especially our own, and of course we're all the heroes in our own narrative, even if we're an anti-hero or some long-suffering Russian novel type hero but the stories that we tell ourselves are so powerful. And we've been telling them for so long, like you say, that breaking through those is a difficult task, because most of the times we don't realize that we've told ourselves this story, that we crafted this narrative, that we are actually in control of it, and we just accept it. So how, one more time, how do we do that?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned skydiving. I'll start out with why you shouldn't do it, or how it didn't work for me, and it has to do with skydiving of all things. So another one of my fears, which is a reasonable fear, is fear of heights, right?
Sure.
So when I've never gone skydiving before, about 10 years ago, whatever it was, maybe a little longer, maybe 12 years. And one of my irrational fears has always been cold outreach, cold calling, things like that, which really butts up against my whole I want to be this awesome salesperson, influencer kind of person.
But it doesn't matter if that's still there's a resistance there, right?
Huge resistance.
Yeah.
Huge resistance. So I came up one day about 12, 13 years ago with this brilliant plan. And I thought, well, another one of my real just horrendous fears is heights. I can't even imagine having jumped out of an airplane. So I say, I know, I will go skydiving. And if I can jump out of a plane, then that means picking up the phone and go, whatever. Like, that's nothing, right? So long story short, I go skydiving. Scariest thing I ever did. I didn't really get to enjoy it because I was just like, a bundle of just raw nerves the entire time. But I did it, right? Next day, I'm thinking, I got this. Still couldn't make any calls.
Yes.
So, again, fear of rejection thing is a very personal thing that I can relate to. So that's how not to do it, at least. Don't jump out of an airplane, please, unless you really want to do that on its own. What worked for me, and what I really advocate just from that personal experience, is again, leaning into it. So what that looked like for me, excuse me, I'm just getting over a little bit of a flu here, so apologize.
Oh, no worries.
How that manifested for me over the last few years was, again, around 2015, learning how to meditate, mindfulness. So, if you're familiar with that or not, it's essentially just, being able to be present with whatever it is that I'm experiencing, instead of just being in my head trying to convince myself I shouldn't feel it. And that's basically the battle that was always going on, right? And there was a book years ago that I read, it's a very popular book by a guy named Michael Singer called The Untethered Soul. And there was a new one that just recently came up that was a follow-up to it. And that was really just changed my entire frame. I didn't realize that this was even a possibility. And the whole thing comes down to, he takes yoga and he takes mindfulness and he kind of presents it in a very practical, pragmatic way. And I started kind of just, allowing these blockages and these fears to just start kind of over time, it's almost like exposure therapy, right? So the example I use, and a lot of people use, is like fear of snakes, right? You don't just throw somebody into a tub of snakes if they're afraid of snakes, right? You start out with, here's a picture, right? So it's the same concept, right? And the difference is for me, it was like, meditation, where I'd sit in these kind of, and I just actually posted about this and put it on the podcast, that part 4 that you were just mentioning. It's just a very simple process. It's just like, okay, spend 15 minutes twice a day just sitting and being present with those, whatever they are, right? And it's amazing how resistant we are to just doing that, right? So like all these things, none of this is rocket science. There's no like complicated chart or anything like that. It's just, are you willing to sit there and be present with all that ickiness and all that discomfort? And can you do it on a regular basis when you have control, right? Like kind of like, it's almost like practice,
Right.
And then when you, I use the example of like, if you're into basketball, whatever sport or any kind of skill, if you want to get really good at playing in a game, you're going to take a lot of shots during practice, so that when it comes to game time, it's just natural. It's muscle memory, right? And the same thing goes for this, is the practice when I meditate and I'm just sitting there and experiencing all this, like, whatever it is I'm experiencing, that way, when it comes time to, I don't know, do things like be a guest on a podcast that would normally sort of spike my anxiety, right? Now I not only know how to actually deal with that in the moment, but over the last few years, the intensity of that anxiety, the intensity of that, whatever negative energy, whatever you want to call it, has gone down so much I can't even express,
Right.
So what I talk about on the podcast and I just, really kind of relaunched the coaching. So it's things that I'm going to be helping clients with in the coaching. There's no magic sauce to this. I'm not
Right.
secret sauce where I'm just like, I'm going to tell you one thing and then the next day you're just going to have it licked. It's a practice.
It does bring up the question, how many of our obstacles bringing it straight back to entrepreneurs, how many of our obstacles in running a business, owning a business, being a solopreneur are internal versus external? Because there are a lot of external obstacles that happen for sure. But what do you think about that?
That's a really good question. It reminds me, I was just listening to your episode with Rick Terrian the other day, and he was talking about, or it's a little bit of older episode, but I just listened to it, and he was talking about entrepreneurship at any age and people that are a little bit older getting into it. And you can imagine there are ones that, I'm 50, right? I mean, I have a lot of stories behind me, right? A lot more than when I was 20. And, your conversation with him was interesting. And one of the things you were talking about were these things about your ideas about what entrepreneurship really is, right? And if you think about that, that's an extension of about who you think you really are. So you think about things like imposter syndrome, right? Yep. Who am I? And I go through this too, right? Who am I to coach people, or who am I to have a podcast about whatever? It's natural, right?
Right.
The difference, though, is that it's very hard to think clearly and to be inspired and to be creative when we're absolutely anxious out of our skin, right? So that for me, again, going back, the thing that I needed to really tackle was this just overwhelming physical anxiety that I would experience, because as soon as that would kick up, I just couldn't even think clearly, right? I couldn't make good decisions because I was just freaked out all the time, and just kind of whipping back and forth between periods of really inspired, like, oh, this is amazing. It's, when it's in your head, it's great, right?
Right.
When it's your idea, it's this perfect little baby. And then when you're about to hit send, it's just like, oh, wait a minute, this is stupid, right?
Yep.
So to your question, personally, I think the internal is really, in my perspective, the majority of it. And that's where most of the podcast and the work that I want to do is really focused on. It reflects to the outside. So for me, I think of entrepreneurship and kind of, let's frame it. When I'm thinking entrepreneur, I'm not thinking Richard Branson. I'm thinking somebody who is a freelancer. They're a solopreneur. They're, even Rick was talking about, he's an engineer or an inventor by trade. So he had a few employees, but pretty small, right? That's the majority of people that are starting businesses. They're not Elon Musk, right?
Right.
So,
although Elon Musk could use a coach.
I've been calling him. He's so far not responded to any of my calls, but I'll let you know when I get through.
Right.
Maybe I'll just tweet him.
But for I say small business owners in a sense, right? But for those people, those are the people who desperately need that kind of coaching, that need to figure out how to get unstuck. Right? I know my business. I know how to do my little business. I say little, as if anything is little when it's your life. It's
our whole life. Yeah.
But you say, and maybe that's a limiting belief too, right? Of I'm just a small potato. I'm just a dude over here doing this little thing. Well, stop calling what you do little. Stop minimizing your contribution to the world. But in the sense that it's so easy to be that one person, and everything relies on you. Everything's about what's going on in your head. Everything. There is no backup. There's no other person generally until you start to grow, and that can be the biggest, I think, hurdle in some ways for a lot of people. Certainly for me, to moving forward and getting bigger and doing the things that you want to do.
For me, is the most important thing is I'm a big believer in personal calling and the idea of what in yoga is called dharma. Greeks called it the daemon, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter. It's the inspiration, right? So there's a book by Rick Rubin, who's a very famous music producer, coming out in a couple weeks on creativity. And I can't wait for this to come out because he speaks that language, right? So this is just like, I'm like, literally, it was at the bookstore on the 1st of January and they didn't have it available yet. So the reason I bring that up is because this is all stuff of, you think about whether it's somebody who's a music producer or yourself in film, or somebody who's just starting what like might be a little bit more of a normal bread and butter business. It's starting with yourself, right? Yeah. So like it goes back to those fears. It goes back to those beliefs. It goes back to whatever those blockages we might experience. Because if we're like, in my case, I had inklings of all this my whole career. I knew what I was interested in. I was just scared to death of pursuing it, really, right? So I kind of nibbled at it. I did a lot of stuff that I'm very proud of, but I feel like I could have done a lot more and I could have pushed it, right? So listening to ourselves and being able to quiet our minds enough and quiet wherever you feel that anxiety enough to be able to get some stillness, right? So you can actually pay attention. And this is where the meditation comes into, where you can actually hear, whether you see it in your mind or hear it, whatever it is, right? Everybody's different. But you can actually pay attention and see, this is my voice. This is what I'm inspired to do. Rather than what a lot of people do, unfortunately, especially when it comes to, or particularly when it comes to entrepreneurship, is they look outside of themselves first. Great example is content, right? So people want to be like content producers, which is great, be a content producers, but they're creating content about stuff they couldn't care less about because they read something that they can make a ton of money creating content. Like, so you just see a lot of stuff that people don't care about, to me, that's like, fine, go ahead and do that. It's your life, but that's not a very inspiring way to live, right? I'd rather, it be coming from somewhere authentic.
I get into the concept of purpose and all those big, hairy, amorphous, 30,000 foot view kind of things. What's your vision? What's your purpose? What are your true goals and all that stuff we think about at the beginning of the year? And then
weirdly enough, yes.
Weirdly stop thinking about later. But those kinds of things, I feel like we don't spend enough time thinking about that stuff in a non-judgmental frame of mind.
Beating ourselves up for having those desires and dreams and thinking, who the hell are we to?
And who am I to? And I'm not going to share all my goals for world domination via podcasting with my listeners here, but who am I to I'm nobody. I'm this little guy. And then you start putting these things on rather than going after it and being honest with yourself. Okay, that is a goal of mine, and am I committed to making that happen? But so few of us think about those things long enough to start to put a plan together and to get down to what would that look like, what would that feel like, and really kind of test those things. Because a lot of the time, I feel like some of our goals are not really our goals, they're other people's.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sorry.
You
got me riled up here with that. Yep.
And so I've said it on this podcast time and time again, and I'm sorry, dear listener, for all of it. But if you don't have a plan for your life, somebody else is going to have it for you.
Yes.
And it'll probably be me. Or somebody like me who's overbearing and overly confident in their ability to think they know what you should be doing.
Which is now in the age of influencers on social media is pretty much everybody telling other people what they should do and how they should live and what they,
Yes. And those kind of things, right? There's a very dangerous word that we've been saying here, which is the word should. And because that implies all this judgment about the fact that what you're doing right now is not the right thing. And it may not be. But let's not get into judging that's bad, that's horrible, that we do that we're in this frame of mind of something that whatever I'm doing is not what is the thing that needs to be happening, and that it's something else all the time, or vice versa, that what we are doing is exactly the right thing at all times, because you don't necessarily know until you've looked at it later. So should is an amorphous concept, and one that we probably Should
eliminate get rid of. Yes. no irony meant. Well, I want to interject real quick, and I'm going to be in danger of getting real woo-woo here on our conversation, but there's related to yoga, and another big influence on me over the years has been a book called the Bhagavad Gita, which is, has like thousands of different iterations and commentaries on it. But one in particular is a book I want to give a shout out to. It's by a guy named Stephen Cope, who wrote a book called The Great Work of Your Life. And it's probably my favorite book of all time. And it relates to basically this whole concept of the true self, right? Yeah. So, we'll have a follow-up conversation about what the self really is, but we're not there yet, right? But basically, on the surface level, it's like, look, there's a who you really are that's not conditioned through your upbringing and through what other people told you and your fears and you were bullied as a kid or whatever it was, right? There's a part of you that was born with certain proclivities and talents and interests and gifts. And our responsibility, according to that frame of like approaching, like you call it philosophy, is our responsibility is to manifest that. Our responsibility is to that what's called dharma, right?
Yep.
So you can't do that if you're wrapped up in your own ego about, I don't want to look bad. I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to run out of money. Whatever, right? Nobody wants to run out of money or look stupid or make a mistake. But the more we're wrapped up in our heads about what we're trying to avoid, again, rejection, failure, the less we're able to really trust, look, we're all artists, right? You're an artist on this podcast. We're all here to create something, right? And we can't create that thing that we're born to create, the business we're born to build, if we're so wrapped up in the shoulds, right? We're so wrapped up on, I'm too old, I'm too young, I'm too whatever, right? So sorry, I had to interject with my little yoga speech here.
There's another part of it to build off of that, which is the comparison game, and talking about social media. Danger. That when you look at most social media, you're seeing somebody's curated version of their life, and keep in mind, curated. So somebody has picked out those moments that show what they want to show to the world. And of course, maybe there's a benefit to doing that for your personal brand story and all those things. And we all do it. Great, fine. No judgment there, man. But at the same time, don't start comparing your insides to somebody else's curated version of their outsides. Absolutely. Because that's all you're seeing. Yeah. And that's that keeping up with the Joneses thing, especially, again, if you haven't done that internal work of what's your purpose, what do you value, what's actually of meaning to you, what do you want to do that would really bring you joy and pleasure and enjoyment. If you could say, I did that, I made that, I helped that guy, I did whatever. Once you've done that, and you go, this isn't connected to my values. That's a great way to help pick what projects you take, how hard you push on something, and how much you put into life. And of course, there are other things that go along with that. If you don't value anything, and maybe you need to have a conversation with some other kinds of professionals. But we're coming to the end here. I've got a couple of questions I try to ask everybody, and these can be very general. These can be very specific to your exact niche. But what do you think the biggest fallacy is that everybody buys into that's really just horribly overrated?
That you can come up with the brilliant, correct plan from the beginning and execute it brilliantly, and everything's going to work out exactly as you imagine.
With no changes.
With no changes. Back in the day when I started, Entrepreneur Magazine, they used to have these like big packet binders with like start a business, right? And of course, it all revolved around a business plan, which I'm not anti-business plan, but for most people, A, you don't need a business plan because you're not going to a bank for funding. And B, whatever you write down in this plan, you might as well throw it out in about 3 weeks because it's just a starting point. Right. So I think a lot of people, back to being stuck, they think, A, I don't have this brilliant idea, which is a whole nother topic. But the other thing is, I don't have the perfect plan. What if it doesn't work? It's not going to work. That's not the point of it. It's all experimentation, right? So it's all about these little bets that you're putting out. This podcast of yours was a little bet, right? Sure. When you started it, you had an idea, and I'm sure it's very different now in a lot of its details, right? Same for me. You mentioned my podcast. I have done 3 prior to this, right? Starting at the pandemic or at the beginning of pandemic. So I was just experimenting with a lot of different things, right? So that's, I think, the thing to let go of is just really like, I have to have this brilliant plan. And unless I know all the answers, that I can't get started. Let that go, because you're not going to have it. And even if you think you have it, you're going to be shocked to find out that most of it is out the door. But the beauty of it is it gets you started. And once you start doing things, putting things out in the world, now you start getting feedback, you start getting information that you can start acting on.
Yes. And that's a great piece of advice, which is get started, please.
Get started small. Smallest viable product, as they say, right? Minimal viable product, whatever it's called, right? Just start with what you can. And that the good news is like what Rick was talking about the other day, on your podcast was, for most of these people, you have experience, right? You can do something. Start with that. Right.
Yes. That's all. Yes. So conversely, what is underrated? What are people missing? What do we need more of?
Well, I'm a bit biased because of most of my profession is involved in selling and marketing, but I think sales and marketing skills are highly undervalued. And I think primarily, at least in the last 10, 15 years, because there's been this push toward inbound, right? So a lot of people starting business have been told that, and plenty of people have built very successful companies and businesses doing this. So I'm not poo-pooing it in any way. But where, it's all about creating the personal brand, but then you create stuff on Facebook or whatever you're doing, and people will come find you and yay. Yeah. But you still have to understand how to write your whatever your copy is on your website. How are you taking what you do, the problem you solve, and how are you relating it to a particular group of people in the terms that they care about, right? That's marketing. Selling, how can you, reach out to people? What are you going to write? If you're afraid to do that, like I am / was, right? It's always still an anxiety for me to reach out to people cold. What are you going to write in the email? What are you going to say on the phone or Zoom, whatever? These are all, I think, key skills that if you think about that plus your professional skill, right? So if you're, whatever it happens to be, I think those two together, all the other stuff, legal, like, setting up an LLC, all that other, like that you can figure out. That there's not a big mystery around that, right?
Right. But the internet can teach you that very quickly.
Or somebody can do it. You can do it for now like $50, whatever it is, you can get that stuff handled. That's not like, again, going back to the old entrepreneur packets, it was like 3 chapters about setting up an S Corp,
Right.
Okay, fine. But that's not what's really holding people back. The S Corp issue.
Yeah, no. And again, that's the kind of stuff you definitely should consider delegating or figuring out very quickly and moving on. Because that's not what's really, unless you want to obsess over it. And
it gives people a nice reason to do that, doesn't it? When they have to spend, I years ago, I had a friend of mine that was obsessing about their logo for months. Who cares? It's the logo's nice. Have a logo, get a logo, but don't wait 9 months to start. You know what I mean? Because you're waiting for somebody.
We have that problem in the movie business. That people will go, I'm getting my outline right before I write my screenplay, and I'm getting my this, and I've got to do more research, and I've got and this is all, as Stephen Pressfield, who's brilliant at.
I love Stephen Pressfield. Sorry.
So Stephen Pressfield is brilliant at and if anybody has not read The War of Art, they should pick it up right away.
Please do immediately. Yes.
But Pressfield's great at crystallizing the resistance, as he calls it. Those things that put you anywhere, and calling it what it is, which is it's resistance. That voice inside your head, it's resistance. That thing that tells you can't write, it's resistance. And needing to and obsessing over your logo or your outline for months on end, that is all resistance from actually doing the work. And just get into it and go. And you might fail. It might go poorly, but you'll learn something and it'll be fine. And you'll get on with your life and continue doing it, because the only way is to get your reps in and continue on. You might write a bad sentence. I don't care.
And his story, speaking of Steven Pressfield, that book, The War of Art, is really the kind of genesis of this whole journey for me. That really opened up my eyes to a lot of stuff when it first came up. And he just wrote actually an autobiography that just came out. That it's called Government Cheese, which is all his story about how he spent decades hitting up against resistance. Yeah. He's for people that don't know him, he's a very, very successful novelist now. So he's made it, right? And but he worked really hard for a very long time, doing a lot of stuff other than writing books. And so he's a great expert at that. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's having read everything of his. I have not read the Government Cheese thing yet.
It's brand new. I haven't even read it yet, but he talks about a lot of stuff that he mentions in War of Art and these are good examples for people though, right? When they read books like that and they see, wait a minute, here's this guy that speaks that language that went through it. He's not Richard Branson, who was like a billionaire by the time he was 30 or whatever it was.
And by some stroke of luck. Well, I think there's one more thing before we close the episode out of kind of life lesson number 3,278. The fact is, so often we look at other people and we believe that they just came out that way, that they dropped onto this planet from somewhere else, perfectly formed and knowing everything that they know, and that they never struggled and they never did. And maybe there's the occasional person who just caught that stroke of luck early. Aaron Sorkin, as a screenwriter, is kind of one of those people in a sense, because he never has really had to work for anybody else but himself. He's never had to rewrite somebody else's material. He's written his own stuff. And that's rare for a writer in Hollywood, especially.
Very rare. Yeah.
To not have had to kind of struggle into this stuff. He caught a break, but still, it's not that he didn't struggle. He was writing A Few Good Men on the back of cocktail napkins while being a bartender in a New York theater. So don't say that even those people had to hone their craft, had to get into these moments and have a lot of things that weren't what they ended up doing with their lives. Marcus, thank you so much for joining me. Folks, if you want to know more about Marcus, check out the Work Self Life podcast at WorkSelfLife.com. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, and wherever you get your podcasts. And also follow him on LinkedIn. Links are in the show notes as always. Until next time, I'm Andrew Wallace, and we don't have a problem. We've got an opportunity.